Indeed. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I'm Simón. I'm the director of CSDS, the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy in Brussels. We are based at the Free University of Brussels, and we are a center of 53 people working on foreign and security policy. And we have a very strong Indo-Pacific focus. In fact, we have a Korea chair, the first one on the continent, held by Ramon Pacheco, who indeed masterminded this activity, and in fact much of our Korea visit, but he couldn't unfortunately join us. We also have a Japan chair, and we're doing a lot of work on China, on Taiwan, and one of our signature products is looking at the intersection between Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security dynamics, which is sort of what we are, and right now we're working on a project that we want to sort of discuss here today about how the Korean Peninsula, the broader Indo-Pacific, particularly the first island chain, Taiwan, and Eastern Europe intersect in terms of trade-offs and so on. So I'm just going to kick off with a few minutes, then I'll turn over to Jung and then Sophie and then Daniel, who will cover respectively the US, NATO, and European/EU elements of that puzzle. Right. So in the last few years, there's been a lot of debate about the geostrategic interdependence between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theaters. I would say that China's sort of decisive enabling of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, but also the presence of North Korean troops on the front line in Ukraine, as well as ongoing discussions about the implications of a Taiwan contingency or Taiwan crisis for Europe, are very good examples of that interdependence. We've also, I would say, over the last few years, we've seen the sort of crystallization, if you will, of two sets of adversarial geopolitical alignments, however loose they might be. So on one side, you have this sort of pan-Eurasian group of continental authoritarian powers comprising China, Russia, DPR, the CRINCs, DPRK and Iran, that are increasingly coordinating their policies, both in relation to Europe and the Indo-Pacific, but also when it comes to pushing back against the US-led or liberal international order. And then on the other side, we've witnessed growing strategic cooperation between US allies in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. Now, it's true that this was very much a Biden administration thing, and I think there's no one better qualified to talk to us about that than our next speaker. But and it's still unclear how the Trump 2 administration is going to approach this puzzle, because so far I think we've seen from the Trump administration an emphasis on establishing a clear ranking of priorities, with China, and more specifically the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific, allegedly, or at least rhetorically, coming first, and everything else being secondary. It also seems that the Trump administration rejects this logic of treating China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran as a bloc, and may even seek to engage some of these countries, like it's been doing with Russia, for instance. And it's also unclear to what extent, although maybe you think differently, Jung, to what extent the Trump administration may be interested in fostering cooperation between U.S. allies in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, because they are sort of pushing us to focus on our respective regions, right? Having said that, even if U.S. allies like Korea or Europeans accept this logic of prioritizing our respective regions, which I believe we do, we also are interested in keeping a broader global perspective and preserving our cooperation, not least because I think cooperation among Indo-Pacific allies like Japan are okay, but also between European and Indo-Pacific countries also provides us with allows for synergies in key areas like defense production, technological innovation, and also gives us an alternative in terms of partnerships at a time of uncertainty about the U.S. commitment to our security, right? So I think taking that as a point of departure, and I'm just going to speak for a couple more minutes. We're currently working on a project, as I was saying, that looks at how the Korean Peninsula, the first island chain, and Europe sort of fit together, or separately rather. And I think this is very interesting because if you look at the Korean Peninsula in particular, there are both intra-regional trade-offs and tensions between the kind of force posture and force structure that you need for a Korean Peninsula contingency and what the US would need for a Taiwan or first island chain one, but there are also cross-regional trade-offs between Korea and Europe, right? And so what we're trying to do in this project is try to get a sense of possible triangular, so cross-regional and intra-regional trade-offs and dilemmas, both in wartime and in peacetime. So not only in a contingency context, but also when it comes to deterrence and peacetime. So what we're doing is looking at how key actors, in particular the United States, the ROK itself, of course, Japan, Australia, and Europe, and covering both the Nato and EU angles, weigh the importance of the Korean Peninsula against other priorities, both in peacetime and in wartime, right? So it's a sort of scoping exercise, if you will. And I think maybe before wrapping up, I think to help us make sense of how Korea, let's say Taiwan, although we're referring more broadly to the first island chain, how Korea, Taiwan, and Europe may relate to each other, I think it's useful to think about three alternative ways of thinking about deterrence and alliance management in the context of these three theaters, which I would call bifurcation, cooperation, and integration. So a bifurcation frame would entail treating Korea, the first Taiwan, and Europe as separate theaters and governed by completely different threat reference and strategic logics, actors, and dynamics, and maintaining a theater-centric approach to defense strategy, force planning, and alliance management, right? So for instance, a bifurcation frame would allow to establish a clear distinction between the China, Russia, and DPRK threats, and to treat them all in their own individually, right? And one consequence of that approach would be to focus on the bigger threat, i.e. China, and accommodate or deprioritize the smaller threats, right? So which might entail prioritizing the first island chain over Europe, but also over Korea, and perhaps prioritizing Korea over Europe from a US perspective, I would guess, right? So a bifurcation framework emphasizes the importance of trade-offs and zero-sum games, right? And underscores the fact that US allies in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific are actually competing for the attention of and resources of the United States. And it also entails focusing on theater-specific alliance and regional at most, and keeping cross-regional links and global links between US allies to a minimum. That would be sort of the current Pentagon DoD Briquetti approach. Then cooperation entails reconciling the fact that security threats are primarily confined to a specific theater, with the recognition that strategic dynamics in Europe, in Korea, and in Taiwan are somewhat intertwined, somewhat being the operative word. So it calls more for a cross-theater rather than a cross-theater approach to deterrence and alliance management. And I think in that context, fostering cooperation between allies in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific might make sense, but only as long as it is clear that their main focus should be on their respective theaters, right? So the emphasis would be on cooperating at the level of diplomacy, economic security, defense industry, but not really strategically, not really operationally, right? And then finally, integration represents a more radical departure in terms of conceptual framework from the other two, and it entails treating Europe, the first island chain, and of course these are ideal type categories, Europe, the first island chain, and Korea, or Europe, Taiwan, and Korea as a single theater, and of conceiving of China, Russia, and DPRK as an integrated bloc, and treating them as such, right? And developing a unified approach for managing alliances and security across theaters. That doesn't necessarily mean that European and Indo-Pacific allies would extend mutual defense commitments to each other across the board, but an integration frame would require much stronger links between all the alliance ecosystems particularly in key areas like command and control, intelligence, or defense planning. And of course, just by way of caveat before wrapping up, it goes without saying that if we look at Europe, Korea, and the first island chain from a triangular perspective, of course, the same framework does not need to apply to every single dyad, to every single pair, right? In the sense that, for instance, it's perfectly possible to envisage bifurcation between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, but cooperation or even integration between Korea and Taiwan because of geographical distance and a much greater degree of overlap in terms of threats and alliances. So I'll leave it at that and turn over to Dr. Pak.
Thank you.
You? Yeah.
Luis, thank you. Just a quick question about who's in the room. Who studies Asia? Who studies Europe? Who studies strategy?
Wow, what do you study?
What do you study?
No one studies.
How about let's start with this room. What are you all working on?
I'm studying industrial engineering, but there is a newsletter and it referred to you and then it sounded interesting.
Great, good.
So I decided to come.
Excellent. Anybody else want to volunteer what they're working on or interested in? Yes?
I haven't set on the topic yet, but I want to work on the Poland-Korea defense relations.
Excellent,
All right.
great.
Nice.
Anybody else? Well, I think today we're going to cover a lot of everything. I think we're going to, in talking about the Europe-Korea relationship, we're also going to be talking about non-proliferation, defense cooperation, what's the future of the alliance between the United States and South Korea, how does China fit in, how does Russia fit in, how do other states, Australia and Japan and Europe fit into all of that. So that's a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. But when in Washington, at least, policymakers and academics have been seized with the possibility of a US-China clash. And that is in part driven, well, in a lot of ways, driven by the fact that the US has US intelligence community, where I used to work, has asserted that Xi Jinping has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready by 2027 to invade Taiwan. That plus Beijing's increasing aggressiveness abroad in terms of gray zone activities, coercive activities against their neighbors and not so near neighbors, plus China's astonishing advancements in leaps and bounds of their nuclear weapons and their conventional weapons and other advanced technologies. So all of that to say that that these factors have converged at this particular moment to suggest that we need to be ready for a potential clash. Now, we can debate about whether China is going to do anything against Taiwan, whether North Korea is going to invade South Korea, or what kind of other coercive or aggressive activities there might be. But for those people who work in the national security space, we have to think about the unthinkable, right? And when you have a confluence of these types of activities and certain drivers are present, that it's really important as academics and as policymakers to really tease out what all of this means. Who's going to act this way? What are somebody's motivations? What are their constraints on their behaviors? And what does that mean for national security, for South Korea's, for the U.S., and for global security in general? Complicating matters on whether there's going to be a clash between the U.S. and China over Taiwan is the potential spillover effect. Luis has mentioned the fact that we have this axis we've been calling them the axis of upheaval or axis of autocracies, where we have Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, all being pretty close with each other. And this is something that we haven't seen in a really long time. China and Russia have clearly strategically aligned with each other for the past at least 3 years when they had the no limits partnership. North Korea is sending troops and ammunition to Russia. Iran is in the mix as well. So we have this confluence of really bad actors doing really bad things. So what are some of the dynamics that might be that might really affect our collective security? The thing about Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang is that they all have different sets of interests, right? Putin wants Ukraine. China wants to be, wants to shape the international order. North Korea is North Korea, but they all do share a common goal, which is to weaken the United States and erode the U.S. alliance network. And in this case, and as others have pointed out, a Taiwan contingency or some sort of conflict in Taiwan is not just important in and of itself, but the potential effect it could have on Kim Jong-un's calculus. Kim might see an open US-China conflict as an opportunity for North Korea to advance its strategic interess. And preparing for North Korea contingency alone is difficult and presents complicated logistics and policy dilemmas for the United States. And these include things like how do you get the 2 million foreigners out of South Korea, and there are many at any given time in South Korea. How do you prepare for a potential humanitarian disaster? And how do you deal with the problem of potentially loose nuclear weapons? And these are just a few of the issues that we would have to grapple with if North Korea collapsed or attacked. But even without these variables, a simultaneous contingency in Taiwan, you can see how the permutations would number of permutations that could that we can tease out. I do think that Kim Jong-un probably is emboldened by how he has positioned himself in the new geopolitical environment. He has a strategic partnership with Moscow. Pyongyang is providing unprecedented military assistance to a war in Europe. And Beijing and Moscow have been shielding North Korea and the international community and from international sanctions. That combined with North Korea's spectacular advancements in its weapons capabilities have given Kim more options to threaten and coerce South Korea and the international community. And depending on the scale, scope, duration, and types of contingency in Taiwan and elsewhere, Kim has a variety of nuclear and non-nuclear tools. These are just a few. He's bolstered his conventional weapons. He has special operations forces. He has an advanced cyber capability. He has chemical and biological weapons that he's used. And he can use any of these in combination or separately based on his risk calculus and his anticipated gains. So even as the threats of North Korea poses to regional and global security, the United States is almost certain to focus on the conflict in Taiwan. So if there are two contingencies, Taiwan is probably going to eat up most of US time and attention. It is really unclear to me, and I want to say that up front, it's uncertain how the Trump administration would approach a Taiwan crisis. For example, in the past couple of weeks, President Trump apparently refused hundreds of millions of arms that were supposed to go to Taiwan. So it's not clear how he would approach something like this. But peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is critically important for US economic and national security. Several studies have pointed out a conflict between US and China would cost over $2 trillion. It would cripple the global supply chain of strategically important semiconductors that we use for everyday things, for our phones, for our home security alarms, for our microwaves, for our cars, for anything that's related to e-commerce, telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. So these are all major things of our modern economy that would be at risk. If Beijing seized Taiwan, in the national security terms, US and allied security would be vulnerable. as China could block vital shipping routes and hamper US ability to defend allies, which would lead to the unraveling of Washington's network of 36 alliances and provide Beijing more power to coerce its neighbors. Scholars have pointed to potential implications such as a retreat from global trade by major economies that could result in another Great Depression of the 1930s. Countries seeking to preserve their autonomy might start to develop their own nuclear weapons. And all of this would lead to a profound hobbling of the US influence and power, security, and prosperity. That said, Washington's goal for the Korean Peninsula during a simultaneous Taiwan-North Korea contingency scenario is likely to be deterrence and restoring stability as quickly as possible, in concert with Seoul and secondarily with other partners like Europe, Australia. Depending on the particulars of North Korea's offensive action, Washington would have to balance credible threats. So let me lay this out. Washington would have to balance credible threats to deter further escalation, would have to have strong, number two, would have to have strong enough and appropriate messaging to ensure Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin do not encourage Kim. But three, it has to be strong enough, but not enough to cause Kim to think that he needs to escalate to protect himself, including by using nuclear weapons. And four, would also have to reassure South Korea. So it's a lot, those are complicated dynamics and trade-offs that the US would have to think about. And in the past, Washington could, to a certain extent, have counted on Beijing and Moscow for some degree of cooperation in restraining North Korea. But the current dynamic is such that there is a non-zero chance that Xi and Putin might support, tacitly or not, Kim's opportunism. In this sense, the US and South Korea could be facing 3 nuclear-armed countries, 2 of which, Russia and North Korea, have threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons in recent years, and 1, North Korea, has actually simulated nuclear attacks on South Korean targets. It is difficult to predict Washington's actions because the decision-making would need to factor in the context of the situation in Taiwan, the nature of the North Korean offense, and US priorities at a particular moment. The US might seek to respond with proportionality, as in the past, to prevent escalation, and a Taiwan contingency would reinforce the need to contain the situation on the Korean Peninsula to avoid diverting diplomatic and military resources from the first island chain. There is a danger that the US and South Korean goals might not be aligned. If there are significant South Korean casualties, Seoul will be pressed to respond strongly, particularly if there's a perception that the US would be preoccupied with China and Taiwan. But a measured approach that mirror North Korea's actions would almost certainly be seen by Pyongyang and some in Seoul that the United States is not invested in defending its ally. Kim Jong-un might be emboldened to further escalate, while a South Korean president might want to show resolve and take actions that would seek to take the initiative. Factoring in the enduring desire for reunification and Seoul's possible overconfidence about its conventional firepower and ability to decisively and quickly defeat North Korea could lead to a situation in which the US will have to decide if or how it should respond to South Korea's moves. On the other hand, if Washington adopts a more belligerent posture and messages that it might take a preventive strike, as President Trump did in 2017, and South Korea follows suit, Kim is likely to lash out, including an attack on US bases in South Korea or use its nuclear weapons to show that he will not be intimidated. And in effect, he might find himself in a use or lose situation. So even though the US might signal that a strike on North Korea is not a prelude to regime decapitation, it would be hard for Kim to take that as the word. And fearing collapse of the Kim regime and potential Korean unification under South Korea, Beijing could take military action on the Korean Peninsula, either signaling its willingness to assist the Kim regime and launching military intervention, or position forces in the Yellow Sea, which it could do very easily. Such a dynamic could open up a second front of conflict in the Indo-Pacific between the United States and China. Meanwhile, the US would need to gauge Russia's possible role in this scenario. Moscow's spoiler role could range from offering rhetorical support to deploying technical and military support, which would further might get Kim to continue to escalate, particularly in light of the mutual defense assistance that the two countries agreed on in June of 2024. In fact, some analysts have assessed that Putin might welcome a North Korean provocation to take US attention away from Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's public threat last year that he would arm North Korea if Seoul provides arms to Ukraine was a stark reminder that, like it or not, for China and for the US, that Russia is a player on the Korean Peninsula. It also likely reflects Putin's perception that Europe is unlikely to come to US and South Korea's aid in any robust way because he assesses European countries' primary threat referent is Europe, not the Indo-Pacific. If this is the case, Europe should consider how it could strengthen deterrence and support diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula. Simultaneous contingencies, likely muddled information and disinformation environment, and misreading of intentions and statements from North Korea, China, and Russia will form a highly dynamic, volatile threat condition, making it difficult to prescribe actions with any certainty or confidence. Nevertheless, new geopolitical realities have shown how interwoven the security of the Indo-Pacific is tied to Europe and vice versa. And it is important for allies to have these difficult discussions together. Thank you. Let me turn this over to Sophie Briquetti.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So thank you for joining. My name is Sophie Briquetti. I work for NATO, for the headquarters based in Brussels. And I'm in what we call the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division, which serves as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for NATO. And my job is to work on partnerships. Partners are countries that are not part of NATO, but they have, so they're outside, they're not bound by the Article 5, and I'll get to it in a second. But nevertheless, they have a form of political dialogue and practical cooperation with NATO. So we call them partner countries, and I am responsible for the relations between NATO and the Republic of Korea. So I'm very happy to be here. And I will explain to you a little bit what NATO does with its Indo-Pacific partners, and more specifically with the Republic of Korea. But before I do that, I would just like to step back and to make a link with the title that talks about three contingencies. So contingencies, you probably have understood, this is a term that we use in our jargon to say if something happens, like a conflict. Maybe you know that NATO is famous for its Article 5. Article 5 says, in broad terms, that an attack on one country of NATO is an attack on all. This is we call it collective defense. This is the principle of deterrence. NATO was born during the Cold War. This Article 5 is a strong deterrence that if you touch on one NATO country, then you have a response from all NATO countries. So this is defense and deterrence, as we call it. And we at NATO, we have been increasing our defense and deterrence, I would say in the last 11 years or so, first with the Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, and and particularly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So our role is to, based on the Article 5, is to protect all of our countries. Now, we also have an Article 6 in our treaty that specifies the geographical scope of Article 5. And the role of NATO is to protect the territories of the NATO countries in the Euro-Atlantic area. What do we mean by that? Euro-Atlantic area means essentially Europe and North America. That's how we call it. So to go back to the title, of course we're looking at security developments that take place outside of the Euro-Atlantic area, but, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, because as we heard just before from our speakers, there's a lot of things going on in the Indo-Pacific region. But we are focusing on the defense of the NATO countries in the Euro-Atlantic area. So just to make clear that in terms of contingencies, we're looking at things, we are protecting our countries from things, our countries in the Euro-Atlantic area. So that means that Taiwan, for example, is not an issue for NATO to deal with as such. It is something that is for NATO individual countries, but not for NATO as such. So with that as a little introduction, let me tell you a little bit more about NATO's approach to the Indo-Pacific region. We have 4 main partner countries in this region, which are the Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. We say in our public documents, such as what we call the strategic concept, which is a reference document for us, it says how we see the world, and based on that, what policies, what is it that we're doing. So in the last strategic concept that we have agreed was in 2022, and in that document, for the first time, we make a reference to the Indo-Pacific region, and we say that essentially that what happens in this region matters for us in Europe and in North America, and vice versa. What happens in Europe also matters for this region. And this is what we mean by the security of our regions is interlinked. We see, and I'll give you an example. If you look at China, China has infrastructure in Europe, such as ports. It has increased what we say military buildup. So it has modernized its military, its armed forces in a very fast way, in a non-transparent way, and that includes in the nuclear domain. It also has signed a no-limit partnership with Russia. So it has a strategic partnership with Russia, and it is providing, for example, dual-use goods, so goods that can be civilian and military, to Russia, and this is helping Russia to continue its war of aggression against Ukraine. So what China is doing, helping Ukraine in Europe. This is where you can see, for example, links between our 2 regions. And I'll give you another example, which is very close to here, the DPRK. We're looking at, and we're watching with concern, including in NATO and Europe, the challenges posed by the regime in terms of its, the fact that it's continuing to develop its missile and nuclear program. This has implications, of course, for the Korean Peninsula, but also for the broader Indo-Pacific region and for Europe, for NATO. Speaking about the war in Ukraine, the DPRK is also, as speakers have said before, is also helping Russia to fight this war against Ukraine, because it is sending ammunition, it is sending troops to fight again, alongside Russian troops. And the question, so that, again, clear link between our two regions. We have North Korean troops in Europe. And a key question is also, what is North Korea getting in return? In terms of technology, in terms of money, in terms of also battlefield experience. So you now have North Korean troops that have fought a war. So that's a key question. And in that context, the fact that we have, those increasing links between our two regions, we think that working with countries like the Indo-Pacific partners, the 4 countries that I have mentioned before, this makes a lot of sense, politically and at the practical level. This is what we do with our Indo-Pacific partners is not about NATO going to the region, because we are centered on the Euro-Atlantic security. We protect our countries and their territories in the Euro-Atlantic area. But so this is not about us going to the region. This is about us cooperating with the region, with those 4 partners, because we share the same values. We share the same interest in upholding international law, this rules-based order, the fact that you do not attack another country by force, this type of things. And because we face the same security challenges, like the ones that I have mentioned before, but also cyber threats, cyber attacks, hybrid threats, this mix of threats that can be about cyber, about disinformation, gray zone tactics, as you were mentioning before. So this is why we work with our Indo-Pacific countries. And I should mention that the fact that NATO works more and more with those countries in particular, those 4 countries in particular, started about in 2017 and started with discussions about the Korean Peninsula, about the security situation on the Korean Peninsula and what DPRK was doing at the time. So our cooperation with the Indo-Pacific partners is not against anyone. Of course, China is part of our conversations, but our work with those partners predates what we have been doing since then on China, and I can talk about that later. And it's about many areas of cooperation. And I'll give you examples by looking now at NATO, at the relations between NATO and the Republic of Korea. NATO is fully committed to its partnership with the Republic of Korea. It is a very valued partner, and we have very good political dialogue with the Republic of Korea at all levels. From working level, me working, speaking with my counterpart, the Korean diplomat in Brussels, up to the level of our ambassadors meeting, our ministers, defense ministers and foreign ministers meeting, all the way up to our leaders, so our heads of state and government. We have the Korean president who has attended our NATO summits. These are those big meetings that we have pretty much once a year, bringing together all the heads of state and government of the NATO countries. Well, the last 4 summits, NATO summits we've had, we have given an invitation to the presidents or prime ministers of the 4 Indo-Pacific partners for them to join some of our discussions. So you see that political dialogue is going very well, and it includes all those levels, and we discuss a number of topics. Korea has, and we are very thankful for the fact that Korea has provided support to Ukraine, which for us is core interest. Ukraine is our neighbor. This is about a country that has been invaded by force. So we're talking about changing borders by force. This is against everything that we have set up in the past decades in terms of international law. So supporting Ukraine for us is a big priority, and we are thankful for the fact that the Republic of Korea has also helped Ukraine, for example, through NATO in the form of a project that we have on military healthcare. We're also working with the Republic of Korea on what we call arms control and non-proliferation. So this is about looking at all the regimes that we have still in place, that to make sure that it is safe we have looking at arms control, so looking at number of open sky treaty, the fact that you're not all the rules that apply to make sure that the missiles, the nuclear heads that you have, they're controlled. We have verification mechanisms in place, etc., and we make sure that we do not proliferate those arms. So we work together with the Republic of Korea on arms control. We also work with the country on cyber to make sure that we are more resilient to face cyber threats. But we're also working more and more on what we call defense industry, because, as I said earlier, our job at NATO, our core task is collective defense and deterrence. And I've also said that we are increasing this defense and deterrence. How do you do that? You spend more money on defense. So you, as a country, in your GDP, you say, we spend more percentage on defense. And this is more than a pledge. This is a plan that all the NATO countries have made recently at our latest summits to say we're going to increase our level of defense spending. In the next 10 years, we're going to get to 5% of defense spending of our GDP on defense, whether it is purely military or whether it is linked to the military, such as having all the right infrastructure that our military can use in terms of, cyber defense, etc. So we are spending more on defense, but the corollary to that, to make sure that we can continue to protect our territories, means that we need to produce more military equipment, more arms, more and faster. So it means that we need to work more with industry, with the defense industry, with the private sector, to get to that point. And I think this is where the Republic of Korea can be a very interesting player, because we know that the Republic of Korea has a strong defense industry. Its companies are open to work more with Europe and be an actor also in the European market on that. We know also, and I know someone in the audience mentioned Poland's Republic of Korea relations on defense industry. Well, the Republic of Korea has good bilateral relations with a number of our NATO countries when it comes to defense industry, like Poland, but also like Romania, Estonia, or Norway. This is something that the head of NATO, called the NATO Secretary General, has said and is saying increasingly in his press statements. We have the importance of working with our Indo-Pacific partners on defense industry. At our latest summit in The Hague in the Netherlands, the Secretary General of NATO and the Indo-Pacific partners published a statement that is available on the NATO website that says we will seek ways to increase our cooperation on defense industry, because we're all increasing our levels of defense spending. So we all need to produce more. We are facing very similar challenges. So let's try to cooperate together on this. So we have the political buy-in from the top, if you wish. And this type of cooperation on defense industry can mean several things. It can mean working together on specific military capabilities. It can be about what we call in our jargon exchanging best practices. So this is about having a dialogue on comparing notes. What is my experience? What is your experience in dealing with a specific topic? And in this case, it can be about how do we make sure that in order to have to build military equipment, you need to have raw materials, right? How to make sure that the supply chains of those defense critical raw material is secure, so that in the event of a contingency, they're not disrupted. We can also have interesting conversations, comparing notes, comparing our experiences on how to work better and faster with the defense industry companies, we as governments, or how do we better integrate innovation. And the Republic of Korea is doing a lot in terms of research and development. So how to make sure that what we're working on, the innovation we're working on, we can also then include this in our defense equipment. It is also about making sure that whatever we produce uses the same standards, so that they can be what we call interoperable. So they can work together. If my system, defense equipment system, is it compatible with your defense system? So this is what we call in military terms interoperability, and that is very important. So these are areas that NATO and the Republic of Korea can discuss, and I think this can be mutually beneficial for both sides on defense industry. I'm here in Seoul because I was accompanying the Deputy Secretary General of NATO during her visit to Korea. So this is the number 2 of the organization, and I was with her, and this is exactly what we discussed over the last 2 days with our Korean counterparts. So I will stop here because I think it's a lot of information you're getting from all of us, but I'll be happy to have a discussion with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Thank you also for hosting us here today. I kind of feel lucky that I'm the last speaker because I hardly have anything to add to what's been said, but I'll give it my best shot. I think, look, there are a few points to make, and the first one is about, I think, as Sophie was saying, how we are capable of expecting the unexpected, right? And if we look in the European context, even after Russia's hybrid invasion and seizure of Crimea in 2014, there were still some who were saying that Russia wouldn't invade fully. So 2022 comes along and there is a full-scale invasion. Now, what that does to our assumptions of defense planning and foresight is really tricky, right? Because it does force us, I think, in all respects, and even Dr. Pak said this as well, specifically about Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula, that even though there are voices saying, oh, this will not happen, as academics and defense planners, we do have to think about the so-called black swans. So that's the first point, and I think also both in a European context, both within NATO and in the European Union, there is significantly more attention being placed on these types of questions from a policy point of view. I think Sophie's already said, in the context of the strategic concept, that there is not only a greater focus on the Indo-Pacific, but certainly within the alliance, there is also a greater appreciation of the, let's call it indirect role that China might play in terms of its meddling in the security of the Euro-Atlantic region. And there have been follow-up statements also and strategies also within an EU context which have gone in a similar fashion to NATO, looking a bit more at the threat posed by China and some of these conflicts. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the idea of foresight or exercises has become much more part and parcel of the way we think in Europe. And I say that because even pretty much 5 years ago, we had one or two, coordinated exercises, especially between the EU and NATO, but they were largely about crisis management. They were not really about, let me put it very bluntly, war and conflict, right? So these types of conversations have come, I think, very, very far within Europe. And there is a much greater alertness of, the unthinkable happening now, especially since Russia's full-scale invasion. I think on this question of, the triple contingency, I think Lewis was saying it very well, that actually it would be very important how we classify such a contingency. Would it be a third world war? Would it be containable to some degree? I guess in our work we would err more on the line of it probably wouldn't be containable if Taiwan, especially in the Korean Peninsula, go up in flames, as it were. But it does beg the question for us thinking about this, of what kind of combination or what type of warfare would we be speaking about? Would it be purely conventional? Would it be some mixture of conventional and hybrid, as we call it? Or would there also be the nuclear or limited nuclear role in all of this? And none of those options are very nice to consider, by the way. But I think the European perspective, especially in the case of Ukraine, has highlighted all three of those angles, where you have nuclear rhetoric, the idea of embarking on nuclear threats to go up the escalation ladder. Clearly on the conventional side, we see what's happening in Ukraine. And then more on the unconventional or hybrid or grey zone, however you want to call it, flying drones over Polish territory or having MiG fighters in the Baltics. Again, I would probably invite you also, especially on that, to think where is the line, the blurred line between hybrid and conventional warfare. So we would also have to consider the mix of these types of conflicts, what they would look like in practice. I think there's another point as well which we have to consider, and that's actually a point that all three of the previous speakers have mentioned, the ability, especially of China and Russia, to coordinate. And that's really important because another factor we have to think about is the potential for sequencing. I mean, there is a temptation to think that all three conflicts could blow up at the same time, which is what normally, at least that's the normal picture we get. But if you study any conflict in history that's, blown out of proportion, it's never really worked in a Big Bang type moment. It's always been sequenced to some degree. You have one crisis which bleeds into another. And the question here, especially for Korean Peninsula, Taiwan and Europe, is to what degree those types of conflicts would be sequenced by Russia and China. And that raises the question of, well, how deep is the coordination between Russia and China? There are many ways of defining it. Some think it's a balance of, equal partners. I'm not sure I would sit on that side. And there is the other that would say the Chinese are much more in charge of operations politically. So this question of sequencing, I think, is very, very important. And then, of course, a point that especially that Dr. Pak made, which is what would the role and intentions be of the US in all of this, right? Which balance could they strike between commitments, Article 5 commitments in a European, Euro-Atlantic context, vis-a-vis what could happen in the Korean Peninsula and also Taiwan. So obviously in that context, the US would be stretched very, very far across the globe. They would have to make choices. I think Lewis also raised the question of trade-offs. There'd be a lot of trade-offs here. And again, okay, if we accept that the Chinese and Russians could sequence events, the question then asks for the Euro-Atlantic partners as well, and IP4, is how would we sequence a response? And I think already you can see in Washington, there are questions or at least ideas that Europeans should be able to hold the fort, as it were, in the case of a global conflict, to give the US a bit more breathing space militarily and politically to engage in the Indo-Pacific. So this question of when and how such a contingency could occur, I think, is very important. Now, when it comes to Europe's response specifically, I think there are three elements that I'd like to cover. The first one, Sophie has actually covered very well already, and that's the question of European deterrence. So I'm not sure Sophie could have said it being a NATO official, but I will say it. The question mark about how far the Europeans themselves could rely on the US in a conflict situation, or how reliable the US is within NATO, is also driving a little bit the politics behind Europeans not only accepting the 5% defense target, but also investing in a very obvious way in their defense capabilities. So there is the question, firstly, of Europeans doing this for their own interests in defense, which is absolutely critical. But there's also this question mark of, well, what could happen in the future if we were faced with a position in Europe where the US would not be fully engaged and would expect us to do more, okay? That's a trend that we see in Europe. I think you can package it also as a consequence of many decades of the so-called free rider issue, which is that the Europeans were free riding on American security. And there is, I think, now very clearly since the invasion of Ukraine, a kind of European awakening to the fact not only that the Ukraine-Russia conflict is important for deterrence and defense on the eastern flank, but there is also a growing appreciation of the fact that investing in deterrence and defense in Europe can also limit the ability of the Russians and the Chinese to coordinate on conflict between the two different theaters. So to stop them having the room to play the game of let's ramp up operations in Europe to take off some of the heat in Asia and vice versa. So an investment in deterrence is a way of actually changing the calculus of Moscow and the Chinese on this front. Now, I think also Sophie was really correct in saying that what Europe's investment in its deterrence has, yes, been about investing in capabilities. And in fact, with the NATO capability targets, it's actually very clear where our shortfalls are in Europe. So now having more money on the table means that we have to invest in these shortfalls. And again, here, that's really important because industry plays its role in ramping up production, even of basic equipment like ammunition, which in Europe we learned the hard way of not having manufacturing sites and factories producing the level of ammunition that we needed even for basic defense and support of Ukraine. So that is now changed in the mindset of industry and also of governments. And then I think there's also a greater realization in Europe, and that's partly because of the US position on Europe at the moment, that Europeans have to invest much more in what we would call strategic enablers in the literature or in policy terms, which basically amounts to having secure communications equipment, satellite capabilities, air and missile defense. It covers a lot when you talk about strategic enablers, but the core basic defense capacities that we rely on basically from the US at the moment, right? So there is also this shift. So I think European deterrence itself is a really important response. Now, that's important because of the question of strategic depth in this discussion. And here, the second point is what role could Europeans play, not only in Europe itself, right? So giving maybe the US a bit more bandwidth to engage in Asia, but also considering that there are really important strategic theaters that are very close to Europe that would also have to have some form of a response. In terms of the MENA region, so Middle East and North Africa, the Gulf region, and the Northwest Indian Ocean, which are incredibly important for trade and supply, that would obviously need a response. And here the question mark is whether or not what combination of the US and European naval assets would be able to ensure openness of those communication channels is a real question. If the US Navy is pinned down in the Indo-Pacific because of the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan contingencies, would that mean that the Europeans would have to backfill US enablers in the Mediterranean, in the Gulf, and the Northwest Indian Ocean? The second component to that geographically is also the Arctic and the High North, right? Which is another theater of operations where the Chinese, Russians, Americans, Europeans, also Canadians, let's not forget them, would have a vested interest in maintaining security in the Arctic region. And of course, we already see that it's becoming a theater of strategic competition between the great powers. So the second question is what backstop or strategic depth could Europe supply or produce within a triple contingency? And then the final point, and then I'll be quiet, is about more of a direct response, right? So I think if we're going to consider a triple contingency happening, that raises really difficult questions for us, because the normal go-to European response for dealing with international crises is largely diplomatic, political, and economic. Now, this is a real problem, because in case of such a triple contingency, the diplomatic side would actually be really restricted. I mean, I could imagine what the UN Security Council would look like at such a situation. And it would put a great pressure on partners, IP4, Euro-Atlantic partners, to actually drum up more support from third countries who are, you could generally class them in the non-aligned or non-interested group, if you want to put it that way. So what role would they play, and what role would diplomacy play in making sure that they don't become easy targets for Chinese, Russian, etc., narratives, or trying to pull them away from a more Euro-Atlantic perspective? That's really difficult even today, but it would be even harder, I think, in such a contingency. The economic side, I think, is also a very difficult one for us, because in any triple contingency, we would imagine that the global economy would essentially come to a standstill, right? And I think Dr. Pak really did a good job there in telling us this. Especially on the resource side, the rare earth materials. We're already seeing those discussions with China at the moment, who look set, at least on the 1st of December, to impose real restrictions on supplies of rare earth materials. By the way, rare earth materials that we use to produce military equipment, right? So that in itself is going to be interesting to see how Europe's rearmament will look like if and when such restrictions come into play. And then, of course, we also have to think as well about the assumption, and that's another lesson we've learned from the Russian case, the assumption of large economies like Russia, China, how much they can absorb in a context of war. The assumption was, and it still is, by the way, in the case of Russia, that economic sanctions will bite so hard that the Russians will come to the table at some point, because the economic hardship will be too hard to swallow. Well, sorry to say that, but the Russians seem to be able to swallow it. For whatever reason, they seem to be able to swallow this. The Chinese is an interesting question in China. How much would they be able to swallow? And this is an issue for the Euro-Atlantic region, because if the go-to tool is sanctions, in such a context, it's questionable whether they would have such an impact. I mean, even on North Korea, I mean, we already have so many sanctions on North Korea, how much more effective that would be. The final point, however, is the more military side. What military role could Europeans supply? I mean, the assumption here is that if European capabilities are needed for Europe and the surrounding regions, then I guess the theory is that there will be less room to deploy those capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. But there are other areas where Europeans could play a role, and specifically on supply of equipment and ammunition. And I think one of the things that Sophie said, which is also really important, is the ramping up of industry in Europe also means that there's a broader contribution to supply of defense equipment and defense supplies, such as ammunition, in the global market, if we can put it this way, which was not the case a few years ago, where we were actually downsizing factories and closing factories. So more of a supply and an ability to produce equipment is really, really important in this context, for all sorts of things: ammunition, spare parts. I mean, if you would look at the Ukraine war with Russia, one of the things that the Ukrainians need is not necessarily the flash tech, which they do very well in themselves producing, such as drones, etc. But it's actually on spare parts to keep the tanks going, to keep their armored vehicles moving. And that's something that, of course, the Europeans are also ramping up now in terms of its production. The final point, however, here is how would that look like, that term of supply in the context of a triple contingency? How would we be able to even transport this equipment? Would we transport it through the US somehow and pool it with the US? Would the Europeans, try to maintain these supply lines on their own? Do they have the military capabilities to even protect, deliveries and convoys of this equipment? I guess today the answer is perhaps, but in a war context, probably less so. So we have to think about all of these, I think, practical elements. The really depressing part of, and I'll end on this, is that I think we've only really scratched the surface of coordinating on this. We are developing, very strong partnerships, and we've heard that, especially in NATO IP4, but we're only now starting to get into the direction of having very sensitive and difficult discussions of, if things really do go bad, how would we be able to coordinate it? But we've not gone far enough, let's be very honest. We've really not gone far enough on a number of the questions that each speaker has put forward today. Thanks.
Okay, indeed, we have 4 experts talking about European security and also some contingency, the triple contingency not only in Europe but in Korean Peninsula and Taiwan. So we had a full of very comprehensive discussion, which was very informative and interesting. Before maybe I turn this table for the Q&A or discussion, let me also provide some of my own perspective from the. It's not necessarily about what you have talked so far, but what is going on. I mean, you already been talking to some of your counterparts in Seoul over the past couple of days. But here in Seoul, or from this part of the world, some of them is anecdote. But first of all, obviously, in the Korean perspective, one of those prominent potential contingency that is Korean Peninsula. So now we have a new government, which is very determined that won't be the case. So that, and the way in which they are doing it is obviously, of course, the alliance and South Korea's own defense capability is the basis of our deterrence against any kind of North Korean ambition or opportunism. But at the same time, they are very much focusing on, again, engaging North Korea, talking to North Korean, and so that there will be no kind of, accident or misunderstanding or things like that. And then from that, so we want to reduce the tension in the peninsula because on the previous government, obviously that was the case. So that's one thing, and in doing so, they are even talking about much more what they call pragmatic and realistic approach to not only engaging North Korea but also denuclearization, such as freeze, reduction, and dismantlement. And we are not going to put too much emphasis on CBID as a precondition to talking to North Korea. Of course, how much Kim Jong-un is okay say welcoming those? No, it's not unclear, and so far it doesn't fly very well. I mean, it's not walking to North Korea. They're still saying, no, we are not going to deal with any South Koreans. We don't trust you guys anymore. But we will see. And second, when it comes to the alliance issue with the Trump administration, obviously the tariff has been the key major issue between the two countries, as is the case with Europe, and also US and Japan, especially when Mr. Trump is coming to this part of the world in just a couple of months, weeks later. And we are trying to settle those issues before he gets here. It seems like the rumor has it we are almost there to reach certain kind of agreement. But the bigger question maybe is alliance modernization, what they call. And in doing so, obviously two issues. But what US wants is, again, it's not a totally new issue, but the issue of a strategic flexibility of US forces or US-Korea alliance, meaning they want to change the nature and major task of US forces or some part of the nature of alliance, not only for deterring North Korean threat, but also in dealing with some broader regional issues, such as Taiwan contingency, which, by the way, again, raised lots of controversies and eyebrows in some quarter in Korea about why should or what Americans are saying. What does that mean for the future of alliance direction and all that? But I think it is pretty sure that that is what America wants, and if that's the case, there's nothing much we can object against. What could be our response and South Korea's kind of alternative solution to that? Of course, we cannot break up with the alliance. it is here, and it seems like American is also very much interested in keeping the troops on the Korean Peninsula. Not doesn't necessarily as it is. There may be some reduction of the forces or the changing nature of the forces deployed here. But bottom line is, does Korea's strategic importance, even from the U.S.-China competition and rivalry, is getting more and more important, not decreased. So in that sense, but then it means, in a way, increasing burden or risk for South Korea's so-called, entrapment risk in case of Taiwan contingency, etc. So, knowing that kind of risk, what is South Korea is trying to do is pushing for this wartime operational control. And it seems like the current government is determined that's going to happen within this government. It has been the case of kicking the can down the road in between the progressive conservative government for whatever reason, especially given North Korea's nuclear weapon program. We are not ready, or we better not to have that back yet. But I think no matter what, the current government is determined. So that will kind of also change a certain nature of how the alliance works and the nature of alliance in the long-term future, which will have lots of implication, even not only between U.S.-Korea, but also between inter-Korean relations in the long run. I think one impact of it, if indeed we have a full wartime operational control, meaning we got kind of more of a autonomy and independence in our defense planning, etc., especially contingency, North Korea, one way or another, whether they like it or not, they have to talk to us. So they cannot simply say, oh, you are the puppet of Americans, so we are not worthy of conversation, whatever. They cannot say such a thing. So that, but also it may have certain implication for Korea-China relations, etc. So that's the kind of alliance front that South Korea faces today, and we have to still work on it and deal with it and talk with Americans. Second, third, finally, but some regional, connection, and even goes to the Europe, the Nato, is that I was in this morning, did one of those Air Force big seminar, which was happening in the contingency in continuation of that ADEX that is going on. By the way, ADEX, I didn't know, that has become a kind of third largest air show in the world after Paris air show and British Pinball in terms of size and participation. And that in that we had this ceremony, and there was like a 13 chief of airports from all different 13 countries, which include chief of air force from Japan. That was quite interesting. I believe that may be the first case that he attended. And obviously the first welcoming remark was given by the newly, by the way, appointed 4-star Air Force chief. And then during the lunchtime, the Japanese chief gave a toast on behalf of every foreign delegation, which to me was quite refreshing. And there was a cheers, and everybody was full of Korean military general cheering for the Japanese chief Air Force giving a toast for Korea. And that's a kind of, in a way, maybe we could call it the Trump impact, or kind of the Nixon impact on during the Cold War. Even though we know that the current new government is known for kind of, before he became president, he's known for kind of anti-Japan, all kinds of progressive liberal agenda, whatever. But as soon as he became a president, he said, no, past is past, but we want to focus on working with Japanese. We know that, again, there's a new Japanese leadership, the lady, first female prime minister coming in, and then again, people are saying, oh, she has very kind of, radical or conservative idea about history issues. There will be Yasukuni and all, so Korea-Japan relation go back. We will see how it goes, but there's a kind of, some people are saying, even with those two leadership, new leadership, still Korea-Japan will cooperate. There's some expectation about it. Why? Because things are different.
Yeah.
The American, as Europeans discussing these days, we are not sure about U.S. commitment. So in that case, what does that mean? As Victor Cha said, enlightenment despite antagonism.
Yeah.
That is what is maybe happening in this part of the world. And that even goes to the Korea-China relation these days. There is a definite kind of movement trends towards, from both Beijing and Seoul, we better talk to each other because over the past years, for many regions, Korea-China relation, especially at the public sentiment, has been very, very low, worst in a way. But obviously the leadership from those capital says this is not good. Letting aside, yes, there has been a kind of strengthening partnership between Russia and China and North Korea, which was shown during this victory parade in Beijing last month. But that doesn't mean that it will be just kind of new Cold War between Korea and Japan, and on one side, on the other, Russia, China, North Korea. I mean, there is a certain element to that, but it's not that simple. I think the pictures are much more complicated so far in this part of the world. Finally, yes, I think still there's a connection between Korean Peninsula and European front. Quite ironically, it was so, in a way, as his kind of, security specialist looking about, very much interested in history. Korean War was the kind of case where the European came in the form of United Nations, the forces, collective defense, and aided South Korea, and they fought against Chinese and North Korea. There we have Ukraine war, there's a North Korean fighting along with the Russians in Europe. Yet at the same time, we are also, South Korean is sending our own arms, one way or another, indirect or directly. Some of those aid goes to Ukraine, but also many of them goes to other NATO members like Poland. So definitely there is a connection. In fact, and of course there is also another element of the comparison between Ukraine war as Korean war to becoming a kind of frozen conflict. Rather than peace treaty or end of war, it will be a war of armistice and etc. Due to many of difficulties from both sides to getting together to settle this issue. So yes, still in 21st century somehow we have this global contingency both in Europe and Asia, and all of which us basically we want peace, we don't want trouble, but we have to be, as you just alluded, we have to be very careful about those things. But and also before it is too late, maybe we need to get together and talk together, compare our own note, well, what to think about what is happening in your part, but also what is your own opinion on our part of the world, and vice versa. And by the way, I had a Brussels is where the NATO is headquarters, and I had the pleasure of visiting headquarters back in 2011 during this global war on terrorism, because I participated one of those NATO kind of trip to Afghanistan 2011, and I was along with British and Americans and other Italian scholars was going into this Afghanistan. I spent about 2 weeks in Afghanistan.